good morning to everyone who's joining us in India from different parts of the country. And thank you, Professor Hapke, for joining us on a Friday evening. It's a bit unfair to you, but thank you very much for doing this. So welcome to the third event of the Gender in Focus dialogue series. While the earlier two dialogues were around women's role in agriculture, our third event is on the gender dynamics in the global fish food economy. Fisheries as a sector in India has been undergoing gradual transformations since the 1950s, and this has only been intensified by the neoliberal reforms since the 1990s. Being a heavily gendered sector, these changes have impacted men and women in distinctly different ways, and often in unequal ways too. Today's lecture by Professor Holly Hapke will help us locate women, their lives and livelihoods within these larger socio-economic transformations that have swept the sector. Professor Holly Hapke is currently the Director of Research Development at the University of California, Irvine. She is a geographer and interdisciplinary social scientist with research interests in political economy, rural development, gender, fisheries and food production systems, migration, ecological conflict, and South Asia. Her specific research projects have examined the impact of technological transformation and globalization on artisanal fishing communities, fish markets, and fisher folk livelihoods in India, technological transformation in flue-cured tobacco industry in North Carolina, transnational Latinx migration in the US South, cultural impacts of Gulf migration in India, and the role of fish in food security for the urban poor in India and Ghana. Prior to arriving at UCI, she spent 22 years as a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at East Carolina University. From 2014 to 2017, Dr. Hapke served as a program director in the Directorate for Social, Behavioral and Economic Sciences at the National Science Foundation, with responsibilities for geography and spatial sciences and dynamics of coupled natural and human systems and transformations to sustainability programs, and the working groups on the science of broadening participation and navigating the new Arctic. Her writings on the impact of technological transformation and globalization on fishing communities in India since the mid-1990s have been influential in moving gender from the backgrounds into sharp foreground focus in our conversations about global fish food economy. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this for us. And over to you, Professor.
All right, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. So I thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. I have basically two kind of objectives that I want to talk about. One is, why is gender important in fisheries research and development? And secondly, how might we approach integrating gender analysis in fisheries research and development interventions in a way that values women's work? I want to talk, but the perspective that I want to share with you today comes from insights from my research, which were mentioned in the introduction. And this includes independent research that I undertook in Southern Kerala between 1993 and 2015, along with my field assistant, David Ian-Carroll, and then a series of collaborative research projects that I've been involved with between 2018 until the present, which include the Dried Fish Matters project with, among other people, Nikita Gopal, who is here, the Indian Ocean Collaboratory on Small-Scale Fisheries Ruptured and Gendered Adaptations, which you see a whole series of people from 5 or 6 different, we have 5 different case studies across South and Southeast Asia. And then a series of other research collaborations, again with Nikita Gopal and particularly Carmen Pedrosa, which I'll be talking a little bit about, or drawing on some of that work. And then recently, a workshop that we conducted at the International Fisheries Economics and Trade Conference on integrating gender in fisheries and aquaculture economics and trade research. I want to My work over the last 30 years has drawn on a lot of different bodies of literature and a lot of different influences, but in particular, I want to pay a homage to and acknowledge the influence of these individuals and their writings. So first and foremost, Kalpana Ram, of course, who's written a wonderful ethnography called Mukavar Women. Carolyn Sachs' work has been very important to me theoretically, as has Doreen Massey, who's a geographer, a colleague of mine and former sort of fellow graduate student at Syracuse University, Preeti Ramamurthy, and then Wilma Dunaway and other authors in a collection of articles, research articles in a book called Gendered Commodity Chains, which are very important. I'm going to be referring to some of these texts, or some of these texts are sort of underpin some of the ideas that I want to present today. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick poll, and so for those of you who are online, if we could deploy the poll, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room, and I know that there are people in person, and so maybe I can sort of see the audience, so maybe you could just sort of raise your hand. But to get an idea of where you all are in terms of your understanding of gender and fisheries, how many of you would consider yourself an absolute beginner? And you can raise your hand or put in the chat. Are you a gender novice, so you know a little bit about gender, but you're really interested in learning more? Are you a gender regular, so you're fairly familiar with gender, but you're not yet ready to call yourself an expert? And then finally, would you consider yourselves a gender expert? So the first question is, why is gender important in fisheries research and development practice? So along, we have now accumulated about 40 to 50 years, about 40 years of research on women and gender in fisheries, and about 70 years of research on women and gender in agriculture. And this research demonstrates that women play an integral role in all aspects of fisheries and aquaculture, and they thus contribute significantly to household livelihoods that rely on those fish food systems. We also know, that the roles in which women perform work in these food systems vary in different contexts, but women are especially prominent in post-harvest and production product transformation activities such as processing and trade. And yet, post-harvest activities have received much less attention in research and development policy and programs than has fish production, and women remain invisible and undervalued in the sector. Globally, women have been generally excluded from national development policies and programs until really only relatively recently. Gender scholarship itself has existed at the margins of fisheries science. Fisheries science and policy have suffered from two biases. One is a disproportionate attention to production and harvesting activities with the relative neglect of processing and distribution. And secondly, fisheries science as a discipline has suffered from a gender bias that has overlooked or minimized women's roles in fish economies. And the neglect then of post-harvest activities and the exclusion of women from research, technological innovation, and policy have created gender inequities and differential impacts on men and women, often to women's detriment, and have failed to empower women in the sector in significant ways. We also know that fisheries and aquaculture food systems are deeply embedded in and governed by social cultural systems and social relations that are characterized by gender inequality, and that these food systems are structured by social divisions of labor such as gender, religion, caste, age, etc., which differentially structure people's experiences of development and economic change. So different groups of people experience development and economic change differently. Even as biological systems, fisheries and aquaculture resources are influenced by sex differences, which is often overlooked in even biological research. And the failure to account for sex, gender, and other social factors in research results in weak science, weak technology uptake, and often policy failure. Some additional arguments for why gender is important is, as I've mentioned, men and women experience many aspects of life differently. They're often treated differently, and therefore they're affected differently by social and economic transformations, innovations, and interventions. So if we think about from the arguments from a business perspective, this tells us that women often play important but invisible roles in value chains, and thus they play a key role in upgrading strategies. So if we want to upgrade value chains, there's an argument to pay attention to gender. From a social justice perspective, is the notion that men and women should benefit from development interventions equally or at least equitably. And from a poverty alleviation and food security perspective, women are recognized to be important actors in achieving poverty alleviation, and fighting poverty is hard if you are gender blind. All right, so then how can we integrate gender analysis in fisheries research and development? I want to talk a little bit about kind of how my thinking has evolved from when I first started doing research in this sector back in the early 90s. And then point to a framework that I've come to adopt in my own work, and advocating that others may find inspirational as well. So I started research in this sector thinking about and asking questions about the impact of mechanization. And by mechanization, I'm really referring to both capitalist development and technological change on artisanal fisher folk communities. And so I was asking questions like, how do global level economic processes affect local communities in coastal India? How are specific places incorporated into global levels of economic organization? And what role do institutions at the local level play in mediating global economic processes and local situations? So those are kind of the meta questions that I was asking. When I began to look at the literature that had already been conducted, I noticed that a lot of research at that time had focused on the impact of mechanization on fishermen, and almost nothing really existed, or very little literature, with the exception of work by Nalini Nayak and Eliama, existed looking at the impact of fisherwomen and on fish processing and fish marketing. And so I then decided to look at my broader level questions about globalization and impacts on local communities from the perspective of trade and market relations in the fish economy of Kerala as it had undergone mechanization and commercialization. And that involved assessing the impact of mechanization on small-scale fish traders from a gendered perspective. And I was particularly interested on the impacts on women fish traders. And so then I asked questions about the social relationships of fish trade in the region, and particularly what are the relative powers, positions of power and control between various groups in the economy, so between fishers, wholesale traders, retailers, commission agents, and so forth, and especially what social cultural factors, including gender, shape those relationships. I also asked about the ways in which institutions for the local distribution of fish had changed with the technological and economic transformation. And then what are the implications, or what were the implications of those changes for small-scale traders, especially women traders, and their ability to participate in the economy. A few years later, I then also went back to Kerala and did work at the household level, and asked about how household economies are organized in fishing communities in terms of gender relations, and how economic change should impact fishing households and the household economy. And so I was starting to get this kind of multi-scale understanding of the kinds of changes that had taken place and how gender was sort of woven throughout those different geographic scales. I then subsequently, and I'll talk in a minute about what I learned from that research, but then the sort of second phase of my long-term research then shifted to asking broader questions about gender, globalization, livelihoods, and the intersection of culture and economy. And so I was very interested, or have been very interested in how gender ideologies in different communities within a locale construct economic roles, labor practices, and concepts of work at the household level. How do those different gender ideologies then inform household livelihood strategies? And how do processes of economic transformation rework gender norms, ideologies, and relations within household and communities? And then finally, what are the implications of these transformations for women's autonomy and status within the household? And the way that I looked at this, I was very intrigued by within Trivandrum district that there are Muslim, there are Christian, and there are Muslim, Christian and Hindu fishing communities, all of which have sort of different understandings about the relationship between gender and work. And as a result, although these communities are located in relatively close proximity to each other and really part of the same fish economy at that scale, the way in which they were connected to that economy and the way in which thus they were impacted by the kinds of transformations that have been taking place were very different. And the way in which this played out in terms of women's work and household livelihood decisions differed across the communities. And so that was a very interesting question for me. More recently, I've been doing work with Nikita on the social economy of dried fish. We've done some work looking at the technological change in labor relations within the ring sector in Kerala. And then I've been looking at more broadly at the impacts of the blue economy and sort of gendered adaptations to those impacts as part of the Indian Ocean Collaboratory Project. And so I've been asking kind of similar questions. And so what have we sort of learned, or what have I learned from these various projects? And the first, of course, is that fish economies are constituted by social relationships that govern economic relations and transactions, and that's very important. So this idea of economies being socially embedded is very salient within the fisheries sector. Secondly, fish markets are highly gendered in market processes. That means that complex gendered norms influence the way men and women traders access markets and move through market spaces. Fisheries development has restructured fish economies toward greater hierarchy and geographic extent, and that impacts different groups of workers differently, both men and women workers differently. Economic and technological change has had both positive and negative impacts on women fish traders and processors. In some ways, it has created new opportunities as well as new pressures, and it's important to understand both sides of that coin. And importantly, different groups of women experience economic and technological transformation differently depending on a range of factors, such as age, economic status, their experience and stage in the work-life course, the familial obligations that they have, certain household pressures, and even their own entrepreneurial inclination. So, for example, in the work that I looked at women fish traders, in kind of the first phase of this, the way this played out is that there was a big difference between women who had started trading fish as young girls, as helping their mothers or their aunts, and had kind of a long lifetime of working in that sector, compared to women who entered into that work as adults out of or from a position of kind of economic desperation. And so the impacts on those two groups of women were very different as a result. The former group was much stronger economically and much more able to adapt to some of the changes, and for them, some of the changes in market structures and so forth that came along with mechanization and commercialization actually created a number of opportunities that they were able to take advantage of. For other women who were in a more precarious position all along, it created more stress, particularly the need for cash, traveling long distances, and so forth. And so it's, how women, and actually different groups of men for that matter, are situated in economies has a tremendous impact on how they then experience change and transformation of those economies. And importantly, a key lesson that came out of this is that women are not a homogeneous entity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that means that we need to take then an intersectional perspective and what that means to understand sort of the full kind of depth and richness of the experience and the ways in which gender impacts experiences of economic transformation. Some other lessons are that the patterns of men and women's work in fisheries is geographically and historically dynamic, and so it varies from place to place, even within a relatively small location, and it changes over time. Gender ideologies variously inform the type of work that men and women may undertake across different communities and households. Even within a community, you'll have households that are, more, quote, liberal, and more permissive than other households that are more conservative, or, some communities that are more liberal about what work women is considered appropriate for women and acceptable for women to do versus communities that are more conservative. And men and women's work changes over time, and that change is not necessarily linear. What we've been observing in the work on dried fish is that women have gone through sort of ebbs and flows, where there have been periods of time in which women have been heavily involved in the sector, followed by periods in which they have withdrawn for the sector and more recently have come back in, and the nature in which they've been involved in that in processing dried fish, for example, has changed over time in interesting ways. Because fish economies are gendered, that means that livelihoods are also gendered, and that there are a range of factors inform the different livelihood options that are available to men and women over time. And that bears tremendously on household robustness and ability to adapt to changes and sort of ruptures that often take place with capitalist development. In terms of technology and technological change, there are kind of two ideas here. Is that one, because of different ways in which men and women are involved in the economy, that means that their technological needs differ. And that technological change, on the other side of this, or aspect of this, is that technological change impacts men and women's work differently. And in terms of their technological needs, women's needs for technology have often been ignored or overlooked, with a few exceptions, or with some exceptions, but generally, sort of, and globally, oftentimes because of gender biases, women's needs have not received the attention that is warranted. And then when economic ruptures take place, adaptations to those vary in gendered ways. So, for example, do people organize collectively to resist change, or do they just try to adapt on an individual level? And there's a lot of literature across both agriculture and fisheries that demonstrates the ways in which gender, even within a household, the way in which gender influences the kinds of options for adapting or resistance that men and women have. And then finally, this sort of leads to the conclusion then that development interventions need to consider gender in complex ways. All right, so how then might we approach gender analysis and consider gender in thinking about fisheries development interventions in the fisheries sector? So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about just kind of review, just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what is gender analysis and what do I mean by gender analysis. So two things here. This is really an analytical process that we use to identify, understand, and describe gender differences and the relevance of gender roles and power dynamics in a specific context. And gender analysis also involves a set of tools to better understand the social, economic, cultural, and political realities of women, men, girls, and boys, and the ways policies, programs, and services differentially impact their lives. A couple of key concepts that I think that are important to consider. We all know what gender roles are, right? These are the sort of learned behaviors or the, what we think of as appropriate tasks and responsibilities that are perceived to be either male or female or associated with men or women. Less work, but really critically important work focuses on gender relations, and these are the hierarchical relations of power between women and men. And this thinking about gender relations emphasizes the connections between women's and men's lives and the interaction of gender with other systems of social relations. It also means that gender work doesn't just focus on women, but really tries to understand women and men in relation to each other within the larger economy and within sort of power dynamics. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of gender division of labor, right? The way work is divided between men and women. An important part of gender relations work looks at intra-household distribution of resources, so the dynamics of how different household resources are accessed and controlled by its members, and so incorporating and kind of understanding of that into our work is important. Also important is the idea of inter-household relations. So a lot of work tends to focus on the household itself, but it's important to understand and recognize that individuals and households belong to larger groups, between which flow goods, labor exchanges, and other alliances. And so asking about what the social organization of these networks and gender and what are the gender differences therein is important. And then, of course, the idea of patriarchy is an important concept. Thinking, understanding the systemic social structures that institutionalize male physical, social, economic, political, and cultural power over women, and how that shapes economic processes. Different types of labor, it's important. Again, I'm going to cover this quickly because I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but we can think about production, which tends to focus on the productions of goods and services for income, subsistence, and trade. Why I bring this up is because it's, this kind of the work that falls into the category of production or productive research work is what typically national governments recognize, value, and account in national economic statistics. Both men and women perform economic work in the fisheries sector, but it's not valued and accounted in the same way. That women's labor is often unrecognized and therefore not considered in program and policy design. And so then we have another category of work which we understand as reproductive work, and this really refers to the care and maintenance of the household and its members, so things like cooking, cleaning, fetching water, fuel wood, maintaining shelters, and so forth, which are all very necessary activities in terms of human life, but they're rarely considered of the same value as productive work. And normally this work is unpaid, and so therefore it's not counted in conventional economic statistics. And coincidentally, most of this work is done by women, and so it's another reason why women's work typically is undervalued within the sector. There's a third kind of work that we don't often think about very often, and that's community work. And so this is our activities that are undertaken at the community level to meet the community's basic needs. So things like provision and maintenance of scarce resources that are collectively consumed, like water, healthcare, education, often tasks that are undertaken primarily by women. It also includes social and political activities at the community and local level, such as ceremonies and celebrations, where communities participate in groups, and these are usually dominated by men. Yet, it's worth asking which kinds of community activities get more attention and value, and why is that the case? When we think about gender analysis frameworks, there basically are sort of two frameworks that have been adopted. Typically, and the one that I see most often in the review work that I do and the conference work that I'm involved in, is very much rooted in what's called the gender roles framework. And the gender roles framework is basically focuses on describing men and women's roles and their relative access to and control over resources. This framework aims to anticipate the impacts of projects on productive and reproductive roles. It tends to take the household as the unit of analysis rather than the breadth of institutions across society. And it tends to assume that women are a homogeneous category, and it tends to generate very descriptive accounts rather than theoretical research. So I have read and heard a number of papers that talk about or describe the gender division of labor in fisheries, but then don't go any further beyond that to explain how that's relevant or to think about how that gender division of labor, is significant in deeper ways in terms of thinking about economy, development, social change, and so forth. In contrast, we can take a social or gender relations approach, which is much more interested in looking at the gendered power relations that perpetuate inequities in society. And a social or gender relations approach moves beyond the household to include the community, the market, and state institutions, and so involves collecting data at different levels or geographic scales. This framework is interested in uncovering the differences between men and women divided by other aspects of social differentiation, such as class, race, ethnicity, or in the South Asian context, caste. And the aim is to understand the dynamics of gender relations in different institutional contexts to identify women's bargaining position and formulate strategies to improve this. And this type of research tends to produce more theoretically rich analyses. Another concept that I mentioned earlier and want to just touch on briefly is the idea of intersectionality. So I think as I've begun to describe, people's lives are very complex, and it's not enough just to sort of look at one category of identity, but intersectionality is a perspective or a framework that has become quite prevalent in the last decade or two. And it's really interested in looking at the interconnected nature of social categories, such as race, class, caste, and gender, as they co-create overlapping and interdependent systems of experience, discrimination, or disadvantage. So then rather than isolating one identity category, such as gender, and then privileging it over other points of marginalization, intersectional theory sheds light on the ways in which various vectors of identity impact one another to form kind of unique subjectivities and experiences. And so when I mentioned earlier that women are not a homogeneous category, it's important to look at how gender intersects other aspects of our identity as people to shape more distinct experiences for different groups of women, say even within a community, or different groups of men within a particular community. And so what I want to offer, what I've kind of come to in my own thinking about gender and how to conduct gender research in the fisheries sector, is I draw a lot on materialist feminism to come up with this framework. And materialist feminism is a perspective that is rooted in political economy, but takes culture seriously, and is very interested in the intersections between culture polity, economy, and society. And so if we think about our lives or experience, the kind of material conditions of our lives, those are really situated at the intersection of different dimensions of life. Or we can think about there are different dimensions of social life that intersect one another. So there's the kind of economic, environmental, and technological sphere. There's the political, legal, institutional, or governance sphere. We have social structures and practices, and then we have cultural norms and ideologies. And what I want to do here is just put in the chat. So for those of you who are online, you can go to this Google document, I hope. You can access it. Let me know after I'm done if you have difficulty, and I'll change the setting. But so I don't want to go spend a lot of time going through this framework in a lot of in-depth, but you can sort of see here how, the economic sphere, for example, refers to things like the resource base, livelihoods, wages, labor markets, trade, technologies, and so forth. Political, legal gets at property rights, inheritance rights, voting rights, participation in governance, power relations that structure access to rights and resources. Social structures and practices refers to things like kinship, descent systems, marriage, sexuality, household composition, family structure. All of these things shape human lives and livelihood options in different ways. And then we have the cultural sphere, which gets at kind of identities, notions of moral authority, ideologies and beliefs about gender, constructions of power and authority, constructions of space, how we understand public space versus private space, and how that's connected to gender. And there are other examples that we can think about. And so it's important, this kind of framework starts to ask us a series of questions, or has us ask a series of questions that get us starting to think about how, for example, how cultural and norms and ideologies, for example, underpin economic factors, or how political and legal institutions reinforce or shape economic factors or social structures anyway, so that there's this kind of mutual influence and intersection, and it also involves asking a series of questions about how change in one of these dimensions then impacts change in other dimensions. It's very intersectional in that sense, of thinking about how the different aspects of our lives mutually construct co-construct our material conditions. So examples of questions, and I'm not going to read through all of these, I'll just pick out a couple, but asking questions about what the resource base is and how the economy is organized, or what specific economic activities underpin local livelihood strategies, and what kinds of opportunities exist and for whom. In what spaces economic activities occur and who has access to those spaces. In terms of political and legal and institutional questions, again, is it, who has access to resources and property? How are resource rights defined and operationalized? Who controls those resources or property at different levels? So within the household, within the community, within the nation state. And in what ways are resources and property rights regimes gendered? In what ways do they support or constrain men and women's livelihood activities and efforts? Social questions ask about how the community and household or family is organized, how power is exercised, how it's challenged, why are some people's voices heard more than others? Cultural questions are around prevailing norms and ideologies around gender, cultural factors that shape women's mobility and access to economic resources, and how sexuality is understood in a cultural sense, and how this influences how women are able to move through social space and engage in economic activities. Sorry. I think it's also important to kind of think about these questions from a historical perspective. And so thinking about origins of a situation and how a situation has changed over time, what factors drove that change. It's important to think about, I've talked about geographic scale. And so thinking about political economy trends at the national, global, regional levels and how these impact local communities and economies, and the ways in which individuals and households are linked to regional, national, and global political economies. And then finally, thinking about technology and what kinds of technologies are developed for what tasks and who benefits, or how is technological innovation impacted by gender divisions of labor and differential access to resources. So these are offered to you as sort of tools for thinking about the context that you're looking at, or anyone doing research in the fisheries sector. Let's see. And I mentioned, again, scales of analysis. So we can ask these kinds of questions about individuals. We can ask them at the household and family level, community, in the market, and at the local, national, and global level, and in terms of the state. And thinking about how do transformations in one sphere inform change in other spheres across space, time, and geographic scale. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is valuing women's work in fisheries. And what I want to talk about here is how we might engender value chain analysis. So value chain analysis has become very popular in fisheries work and as well as agriculture. And so how can we integrate gender into our analysis of how value chains are structured and operate? So first of all, we need to think a little bit about what value means. And what I want to suggest here is that, and this comes from work that I did with Carmen Pedrosa, is that value is more than just a financial contribution in economic terms. It's really a social relationship between people that includes intangible aspects, both tangible as well as intangible aspects that are beneficial for fishing communities' livelihood, or fishing households' livelihood. For example, aspects around reciprocity, sharing, social status. Value is context specific and varies between individuals over time. And if we think about the value chain and the different nodes of that chain, fish workers in each node of a commodity or value chain generate multiple social values that shape the nature and outcome of fish economies. And so that then leads to the conclusion that to account for the value of women's work, it's necessary to consider both the tangible and the intangible contributions from that work. So the quantitative, economic financial contribution, as well as the qualitative or more social value that that work generates. So I mentioned, for example, earlier, reproductive work is highly, highly important to social well-being and to our very existence. And yet, because it's often not remunerated, it doesn't count in considerations of value in women's work. And is one of the reasons why women's work is undervalued, ignored, if not actually devalued. And so one of the frameworks that I think I have found really helpful and informative for thinking about value chains is feminist commodity chain analysis or research. And feminist commodity chain analysis differs from kind of more conventional value chain or commodity chain or supply chain research, in that tends to focus on things rather than people. So feminist commodity chain research focuses on people. It draws on anthropological and sociological approaches that emphasize social relations and power, as well as historical and geographic context. And it understands and views a commodity or value chain as a network of labor and production processes that are rooted in gender and racial and ethnic inequalities, or caste inequalities, or class inequalities, depending on the particular context where we're doing this work. What commodity chain analysis, feminist commodity chain analysis does, it really tries to broaden attention to diverse forms of labor and then to map the ways in which both unpaid, paid, and unpaid informal labor contributes to production at each node of commodity chain. So we're very familiar in how paid work contributes to value chains, but feminist commodity chain analysis really wants to include unpaid and informal labor. And so Dunaway, for example, argues that households represent millions of structural units that enable commodity chains to conceal the economic benefits that they acquire from workers. So and particularly women's work, and that oftentimes the idea here is that women's unpaid work really supports a lot of the value that's generated through the value chain, but is completely unrecognized. And so asking questions about who's doing what work, how is it remunerated, and what power relations underlie the conditions of that work. And then incorporate this framework also involves incorporating households into value chain analysis. And so moving away from firms, buyers, and marketing corporations as the unit of analysis to thinking about households as the unit of analysis and asking about what labor subsidies do households and women provide to value chains? What invisible costs do value chains externalize to households and to women? And what are the gendered social relations within the household that generate subsidies and costs? And then finally, feminist commodity chain analysis is very interested in analyzing patriarchy, and so asking around about how patriarchal structures and ideologies underpin commodity or circuits and value chains, and in what ways women assert agency within patriarchal structures. So just to kind of conclude here, and then we have a few minutes for some questions and comments that I'm happy to entertain. Just to kind of come back to the sort of point that argument that I am trying to make here is that research on sex and gender in fisheries and aquaculture enhances the robustness of fisheries science, which in turn supports stronger policy, and that this is really important for ensuring social equity and food system transformation. However, to realize the full potential of robust gender analysis, we need to deploy theoretical concepts and methods that allow us to interrogate the social relationships that underpin aquatic food systems. And that political economy frameworks, such as those offered by materialist feminism and feminist commodity chain analysis, offer viable approaches for fisheries research and development planning in ways that can help capture nuance, complexity, and diversity. And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I'll happy to take questions or listen to comments that you might have.